All right, who in the room knows what this is? Betting most of us. In case you don't, this is the message that the creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, embedded into the Genesis block. And although most of us are familiar with this, I think a lot of the time what can happen is we get wrapped up into all of the minutia of Bitcoin, all the tech details, all the debates, and we kind of forget that the entire purpose of what we're doing here is to rebuild what has become a catastrophically broken financial system. Now, we're all familiar with phase one of Bitcoin's life, which started right here with this message. Satoshi Nakamoto creating what is probably the most perfect money the world's ever seen. But what I want to talk about today, and what we've kind of been talking about this entire conference, is what does phase two of Bitcoin's life actually look like? So there's another popular saying in the Bitcoin community that most people here are probably familiar with. Fix the money, fix the world. And I think this is directionally true, but I think it's a little bit oversimplified. As we see some of these large entities starting to become attracted to Bitcoin, starting to pick up on it a little bit, we see huge companies like MicroStrategy buying up, financial institutions like BlackRock becoming more and more interested in it. On one hand, that's a good thing because it means that adoption's increasing, Bitcoin's going mainstream, people are realizing more and more, okay, this is something real, it's something valuable. But I think along with that, we need to develop a healthy sense of skepticism about why these institutions are buying up all of this Bitcoin. Do we think that they're interested in the grassroots, the bottom-up, the decentralized, freedom-empowering technology that we're all here for, or is it just as likely that the reason they're buying all this up is because they're trying to preemptively seize control of the economic motor of the world by controlling what's going to be the new fuel? So what do I mean when I talk about the economic motor of the world? To set a little bit of context for the rest of the talk, I want to go over definitions for a few words that I think will help us kind of get on the same page, because they're words that are often overused, but I don't think thought about as much, at least not in this, maybe in this particular context. So the first one's capital. I think for the purposes of this, we can think about capital as the financial resources allocated to produce goods or services that are valued by others. Finance. The mechanism for directing that capital to endeavors deemed valuable, and this is the important part, by those who wield influence within that system. I don't think most people realize how much of an outsized effect on the direction the world and the economy heads is affected by what is, for the most part, a large-scale behind-the-scenes financial system of people deciding where this capital should and should not be allocated to. Which brings us to the next definition, decentralized. And in this context, I'm thinking about this as an open system guided by a distributed network of individuals with no central authority to exclude participation. Again, that last part is key. Something that I think that we've seen is that the term DeFi has become almost meaningless because it's such a buzzword. It's supposed to mean decentralized finance, a system of allocating capital that has no central authority to exclude participation. But what we see is that in practice, that's not really what's happened a lot of the time up until now. And I think that Bitcoin can actually be the solution to that. What happens is we have these decentralized financial systems, or what in theory are supposed to be, but they're built on sand. They're not built on a solid foundation. They over-financialize everything. They get obsessed with tokenomics and these tokens that are built on thin air. They spiral out of control with crazy yields. People eventually realize they're not built on anything, and they collapse. That is not what we're going for. That's not what we want in a decentralized financial system. So let's dig in a little bit more on this idea that finance is the motor of the world. Much of what actually happens in the world is dictated by capital allocation. Bitcoin fixed a lot by just being a better fixed supply of money. And then one of the things that I think it fixed the most is that it means that those closest to the money printer can't just then go to that money printer and print more money for whatever they happen to think is important at that time. But what if those same powerful organizations and institutions, even though they couldn't print more of the money, what if they controlled an outsized percentage of this fixed supply of money? I still think that's a problem that's worth talking about, and I think that's why we need to pay attention to what we're actually building on top of this system. Those people will still have a significant amount of power in moving the world the direction they want to see it go. In his book, Hidden Repression, Alex Gladstein goes into detail about what large institutions like the World Bank and IMF, how they exert influence in the world. And essentially what they do is they will go into these developing countries and they will basically extort them with what are large-scale predatory loans given to corrupt governments in order to facilitate what they call economic development, which actually ends up destroying the local economies in exchange for what the special interests working with the IMF and World Bank have deemed important. We don't want those people to own a lot of Bitcoin and to be able to allocate it towards causes like that. So, Bitcoin fixed the money, but I think L2s will fix the systems. With Bitcoin, we do see the embodiment of this perfect money, but its ability to be that perfect money means that it comes with intentional limitations on it. We see the slow transaction times, we see that it's got limited expressivity in the scripting language. And so, if we want to use Bitcoin in any of this strategic, large-scale capital allocation we're talking about, we either have to attempt to create new systems with more functionality, which is kind of what Ethereum did, but I think that's solving the wrong problem. That's trying to add expressivity and functionality to the base layer system, which inevitably is just going to increase complexity, cause all sorts of security holes. I think that's the wrong direction. The other option right now is you can give your Bitcoin to somebody else and hope that they will do the right things with it. I don't think that's the correct option either. Because of these intentional limitations that are placed on Bitcoin to make it as secure and decentralized and robust as it is, Bitcoin will be used by people and institutions in layers. That could mean all different kinds of things, but very few people are ultimately going to be interacting with Bitcoin directly at the L1. So it's up to all of us to make sure that those layers that people are using are going to be built the right way, namely in a decentralized way. I view Bitcoin not just as money, but also as the perfect settlement layer, and large fees are good for the network. So when we see these very large transactions and we see high network congestion, that's a good thing for the network, but what's not good for is the average user. L2s can come in, offset some of that cost for these sort of lower security transactions, these smaller everyday transactions. We can see stuff like that in Lightning, and then have those all sort of collectively settle on the Bitcoin network, so we still ultimately have that finality, but then we also have a little bit more of a user-friendly interface on top of it. Because digital gold is a good way to think about Bitcoin, but the buy and hold methodology is not necessarily good for the network long term, because as we see Coinbase rewards start to dwindle, the network's going to mainly be reliant on transaction fees. We need activity on Bitcoin in order to keep the network alive in the long term. Remember, we're not talking about just the next 10, 20, 50 years. We're talking about what is the financial system going to look like with our great-great-great-grandkids 500 years from now. If we want to think of that long term and actually build a new system like this, we have to start working on that now, and I think that's where layers come in. And the good news is, there's a ton of experimentation happening in the Bitcoin space on this right now. My background's in development. I'm a developer advocate, and so I speak to developers all the time. I cannot tell you how many developers I've talked to that started off as Bitcoiners, moved into Ethereum and Solidity development because they could actually build things there, and now we're coming back into Bitcoin because, oh, wait a minute, people are actually starting to experiment and build cool things on here. We've got all kinds of things happening. We've got Lightning, which is a layer that doesn't necessarily expand functionality, but it drastically increases scalability. We've got other layers like Liquid, Rootstock, Stacks that are all aiming to, okay, how can we take some of this Bitcoin, securely bridge it over to an L2, be able to expand that functionality and securely bridge it back over to the L1 so that we still have that finality. We've got newer things that are in discussion right now, Drive Chains, Spider Chains, ZK rollups. We don't necessarily know which one of these are going to take off, what the market is going to like, what the market is going to not like. The important thing is that they are happening and that we are all here building on them, experimenting from them, learning from each other, because ultimately, Bitcoin will be interacted with at layers. That's sort of the main thing that I'm trying to get across right now, is that the L1 is the foundational layer, but people will interact with layers of some kind. It is our job to make sure that we build those with the same ethos and with the same principles in mind as Bitcoin itself, which is decentralization and security at the forefront. Thank you.